One of the things that was distinctive about growing up as the child of a historian, but also actually broader in a family that had such a deep sense of the past, is that the stories that you grow up with, and I don't just mean kind of family histories, but stories that people in your community are always embedded in larger stories.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. One of the great beliefs of Robert Menzies was that history is not simply about the past, it is about belonging. He spoke of the great human procession, the idea that we are not isolated individuals, but inheritors, shaped by those who came before us and responsible for those who will come after. But what happens when that sense of continuity begins to fade? In the 21st century, we increasingly live in what might be described as an ahistorical age, an age in which the past is no longer a source of wisdom or identity, but something to be discarded, rewritten, or even condemned. The result is a curious paradox. We are more connected than ever, yet less certain of where we belong. We're more expressive, yet often more anxious. We're more informed, yet less grounded. And this raises a deeper question. If we lose our sense of history, do we also lose something essential about ourselves? Well, joining me today to explore these really important questions is Sarah Irving-Stonebraker, who is an Associate Professor of History and Western Civilisation at the Australian Catholic University. She's also the author of Priests of History, Stewarding the Past in an Ahistoric Age. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Sarah.
Oh, thanks, Georgina. It's great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on Afternoon Light. We've been wanting to get you on for a long time. You have written very much about some of the issues that we at the Robert Menzies Institute grapple with every day. This idea that at a moment of huge connectivity, myriad of information at our disposal, we see our institutions really giving up on history. Our media, our legislature, cultural institutions, our tertiary institutions. History is becoming uninteresting for them, irrelevant, and current generations have less and less of an understanding and a connection to history. You've written about this and you've called it an ahistorical age. Just tell me, what does that mean?
Yeah. So I think the ahistoric age is a term that I think is so apt to describe this sense that we have, that we are so disconnected, actually, ironically, from the past. There's a sense that we don't actually know how to engage meaningfully with history. So in other words, what is history? How is it actually helpful to us? How can it help us flourish? We're basically living in an age in which really the past seems, I actually think there are three kind of attitudes that describe this ahistoricism. The past seems irrelevant to us. We're ignorant of the past, and we basically kind of reduce it to ideology. So when I say, for example, that we generally think of the past as irrelevant, that's because today our vision of the good life, really, if you ask a young person, what do you think life's all about? It's basically a sense that we are our own kind of autonomous, self-creating beings. Life is about self-invention and discovery, going on my own journey. But because of that, we largely disconnect the individual from the larger stories of which they're a part, the enduring narratives that in previous generations have given people a kind of given sense of identity, because we're all being autonomous and authentic. But what that does is it disconnects us from these larger stories. And so especially young people, they bear this kind of enormous existential burden to just go out and relentlessly invent themselves because they are disconnected from larger stories. So in that sense, the past history is kind of irrelevant to our sense of what makes a good life, largely in our culture. It just seems irrelevant. Why is history even relevant if life's all about self-invention?
You're a historian. I work running a history institute, not a trained historian, but I've certainly been living and breathing it for the last 5 years in this role. It's just impossible to imagine that people think that history is irrelevant. I mean, I just cannot believe that they do. But I mean, it is true. There's this sort of sense that people are just disinterested, that they think it's not, I've had people say to me, Robert Menzies, who we honour at the Menzies Institute, he's an old guy. He's been dead for, almost 50 years. He was in government over 60 years ago. What does he matter? He's a figure of the past. Why should we bother talking about these old people, these old dead white men? And I think, wow, old dead white man he may very well be, but someone who had ideas that shaped a nation, shaped the sort of middle-class values of Australia through the 50s and 60s, someone who set up institutions that we just take for granted that they exist today. Why were they set up? Why were they set up that way? Should they have been set up another way? What were the things that were taking place in Australia at the time that led to these decisions that we still have the ongoing impacts? And then that idea that we're part of, as you say, a bigger story, the great procession of life, that it's not just Georgina Downer born in 1979 and, whenever I will end, that is that sort of finite period of my life disconnected from the bigger picture, that we're part of something bigger. That then gives you a sense of meaning.
Yeah, that's so true. And even when I think back to, I taught Menzies' Forgotten People speech recently, and, it's interesting, even in that speech, I remember my students reading it, and there's a clear sense in that speech actually that Menzies understands something of the larger civilizational story. And he talks about the arts and culture. And I remember my students reading it and actually being kind of taken aback that somebody that they had kind of dismissed for various reasons had an appreciation of arts and culture, for example, and said things that they were really even surprised about. But, the other thing that you were saying about the kind of irrelevance of history to most people today points to something else, which is that we tend to be really quite ignorant, actually, of, even though we have particular things that we value, ideas, perhaps institutions, those that we haven't lost trust in, or those that we wish perhaps that we hadn't lost trust in, we tend to be incredibly ignorant of where they actually came from, like you were saying. And actually kind of ignorance, I think, is that second characteristic of this ahistoric age. So, for example, when I talk to any of my undergraduate students about, say, human rights or the rule of law, and they'll value those things and talk about them as being really important. But then when I say, who knows anything about the history of human rights, where they came from, and, because they're not actually universal ideas that have just existed in every civilization across time and history, but they actually don't know much about where they came from. So it's ironic that for all the value that we might attach to certain ideas, we don't actually know much about where they came from. That's ignorance. And actually what you were saying too about the fact that occasionally there is a sense. So history, I think, is largely seen as irrelevant, except for when it might serve some ideological or political end. And I think that actually points to the third characteristic of the ahistoric age, which is ideology. So in other words, when history is actually discussed, unfortunately, increasingly, and I think particularly this is because of the online nature of much discussion these days, it tends to be reduced to ideology. And I don't just mean culture wars, though that's part of it, but also the kind of sense in which when discussions occur online, they tend to be sensationalized. They work with this metric of this kind of algorithm of, what creates outrage. But what that actually does to historical discussion is that it flattens the past into just these totalizing categories. Somebody is either completely evil or somebody to be celebrated. So there's no room for any kind of ethical complexity. And yet, of course, in history, there's all kinds of ethical complexity in the past. So I think those three categories, irrelevance, ignorance, ideology, they really describe this ahistoric moment that we're living in.
That's a lot to unpack there. It strikes me as extraordinary that we have this level of, I guess, complacency, the sense that it's irrelevant, and then this ignorance of our history at a time when we are, at least in Australia and I'd say across the West, more educated than ever. The numbers of people who are able to not just finish secondary school, which is much higher than it's ever been, but able to go to university is unparalleled in Australian history, but I'd say in Western history.
Yeah.
And yet we may be educated, but we're also failing to be educated in the sort of bigger picture of our society, aren't we?
Yeah, that's right. I think some of that probably has to do with the fact that I think for various reasons over the past several decades, there has been a tendency to reduce the ideas about what education is for in Australia to the idea that it's purely utilitarian. Like it's just about job readiness, just to be ready for the workplace. But what that does, of course, to the humanities generally, but particularly to history, is that it completely devalues it. And I think it is because we've got this broader sense that we don't really understand that actually history, and this is also true, I think, for the rest of the humanities, they do form citizens, they form character. But if you lose that, then you don't actually see it as important. And so the only question then that seems to be asked is, well, how will this get you a job? But I think that's really sad because actually, one of the things that is so striking and I think so incredibly rich about studying history is that when you engage with, when you read about the lives of people in different cultures and civilizations, and of course back through time, you are actually compelled to understand the lived experience of people whose lives are so radically different to your own, who had different, I say this to my students every semester, but, be ready for the fact that we're going to actually engage with people whose lives and whose beliefs, sometimes perhaps really you'll find them offensive. Some things you'll agree upon, but it generates empathy, it generates humility, it forms character.
Yeah. This sense that we live in an ahistoric age, is this specific to Australia, to the West, to the Anglosphere? Is it recent, or are we perhaps, because of this presentism we face, are we believing that we are worse off in terms of our historical knowledge and appreciation than generations before? I mean, how have you, in your research and experience, of course, how have you conceptualised this issue?
Yeah, that's a really good question because you're basically saying, okay, what's the history of the ahistoric age? Is it a global thing? Is it just Australia? I think it's actually something that applies generally across global culture, but particularly in the West for a number of reasons. Look, broadly, modernity, particularly late modernity, it's very highly sort of individualistic cultures, right? Where we tend to think that the pursuit of the good life is basically about, like I mentioned earlier, forging our own journeys and our own destinies. And there's been a particular sense, I think, particularly in the last half century or so in the West, in which there's a loss of the idea that we do have certain shared narratives and stories as peoples, as nations, that we can think about and talk about and that might give us unity. I think that's sort of partly a phenomenon of liberalism, not the classical liberalism in the Menzies sense, but in a kind of cultural, hyper-individualistic liberalism. There's a kind of sense that, well, I'm not really part of any larger shared story. So I think it's a global phenomenon of Western culture. But in terms of when it actually began, I think it's really exacerbated by technology and by consumerism. Because, of course, the logic of technological advancement, particularly the kind of rapid technological change that we've seen in the last decade, but now even with the advent of AI, how fascinating is it that universities and at schools, in education, as we are elsewhere in other fields, but we are rapidly just trying to keep up, day to day with the advances of AI. But the logic of rapid technological change is one of obsolescence. Something is outdated and therefore irrelevant. But it's a broader logic, therefore, that this is entirely consistent with the logic of consumerism. The thing gets outdated, so we upgrade. But that cultural logic, therefore, I think is something that does sort of shape our general orientation towards the past.
Yeah. So you don't see this in, say, Asian cultures, this ahistoric age phenomena of irrelevance, ignorance and ideology? Say, for example, a country like Singapore or Japan, Korea, China even, India, and they're countries that very proud of their history and their sense of civilization, deep culture, uniqueness. They don't suffer from the same phenomenon of, history doesn't matter anymore, it's irrelevant, I don't really want to learn about it.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I think that probably the interesting complication in those countries is the sort of coming together of their traditional sense of the past, which may not, because they're not countries that are part of the West, they have a sense of past that may not actually be particularly like Western senses of linear time. They just have a different understanding of time in their history. But broadly speaking, I suppose the question there and the complication would be, to what extent has this kind of, because I think it's an effect of globalization and Western sort of hyperliberalism. So I think in those countries, it is probably the case, though I'm not an expert in the histories of those countries or their contemporary culture, but there the complication is the sort of coming together of their traditional senses of the past, whatever that is, and the confrontation of that with the contemporary logic of ahistoricism in the rest of the Western world.
You say that technology has sort of hastened an ahistoric age. but also point to hyper-liberalism, this sort of, I guess, very individualistic, consumerist, in the moment, want it now culture. Do you think, though, that liberalism then has had its day, that we are entering a post-liberal age where there might be people seeking different answers that aren't around freedom of the individual, the things that I guess, I would call myself a liberal. I believe in liberalism. I think it has shaped our democracy, our way of life in a country like Australia for the better. But I can see there's, because of this sort of concern around the individual's progress and growth, that there can sometimes be a disconnect. And I mean, Menzies would have argued very much against this with his conception of liberalism, but there can sometimes be a disconnect between the individual and the community that surrounds them.
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. And as you know, and as I'm sure your audience know, there are all kinds of contemporary commentators, but also philosophers and scholars like Patrick Deneen at the moment who are sort of writing about this common
why
theme.
Liberalism has failed.
Why liberalism failed. Is the day of liberalism over? I think it's really interesting. I mean, I think clearly in the world, when you look at the populist movements, actually on the far right and the far left, and the fact that actually the commonly spoken about horseshoe effect is quite interesting here, isn't it? That at their extremes, there's actually not a lot between the extreme right and the extreme left. It is interesting the extent to which both of those kind of novel populist movements around the world are distinctly anti-liberal. That is really interesting. And I think as a historian, one of the things that you observe about Western liberal democracies, I actually taught I teach a unit in our Western Civilisation program on the history of liberalism. And one of the really interesting things about it is that while on the one hand, the liberal political tradition does, this is one of its defining features, right? It does make possible a sense that the state is effectively neutral with respect to morality to some extent, like in the sense that, when really the foundations of liberalism are laid after the Protestant Reformation, it's because Europe is now grappling with this phenomenon of how to create a state where there's a multiplicity of potentially different religious beliefs. And so the state becomes neutral and you basically privatize a sense of the good. But the point about that is, though, that while on the one hand, you have this potential driving force of liberalism that says, we'll privatize the good to the nth degree, it has always been the case historically that there has been enough of a shared story and of a shared sense of an overall good that there have been limits, as it were, to the liberal project. So there have been, and people like John Locke onwards have talked about what are the limits of liberalism. In other words, this is tolerant, and this is the key historical word too. This is a tolerant society. However, it's had limits. But I think the point about this historical conversation for your question about has liberalism failed or is it over, is that it is interesting that neither of these kind of contemporary extremist movements, because they're anti-liberal, recognise anymore that there's a kind of overarching story about what is shared in liberal democracies, and therefore there's kind of a sense that because nothing is shared anymore, then there are no limits. We don't know where to put them. I think the recent kind of awful phenomenon of anti-Semitism that we're seeing in Australia is a really interesting example of this, where historically it's been, I think, very clear that there are limits to the idea that, as Australians, we're not going to tolerate people who literally want to exterminate an entire race of people. But I think clearly now there's a question of, perhaps this is an acceptable belief system. That is probably a good illustration of the fact that the question of the limits of liberalism is clearly something that's under such contemporary scrutiny.
Mm. You grew up as the child of a historian. I was interested in your father, and as someone who has a prominent father, I appreciate you sort of groan a bit when people want to talk about your family members rather than you, but bear with me. Interested in reading about your father, who's a radical historian and, as far as I can gather, a Marxist, very left-wing. So you presumably grew up in a household of deep ideological beliefs. When you have been doing your research in this sort of ahistoric age, and you're talking about the sort of prescriptions of it, the relevance, ignorance and ideology. Ideology is a big factor. How has that upbringing influenced your diagnosis of this ahistoric age, where you have a parent who has brought such an ideological lens to history?
Well, I think, we have to be careful when I use the word ideology, I mean it in a kind of reductionist sense. And so just because somebody has a different political belief system and approach to history, it doesn't for a moment mean that it is ideological as such. So in other words, there are ideological Marxists. However, my dad was never one of them. And so while it was an upbringing that was very clear about what a sense of the collective good and the real sort of material and economic, I think Dad would be okay with this description. The idea that, there's real inequality in the world and the basis of that inequality is material economic oppression. It was never ideological. And so actually, I think one of the incredibly rich aspects of this upbringing was that it was deeply sort of intellectual and deeply historical. And so there's always a kind of sense that you'd sort of engage with the past and be really aware of the kind of theoretical perspectives, for example, of the historian and where they came from. But I think more broadly, on a personal level, I was kind of reflecting on this idea is that you become a historian, and it's interesting when you follow the pathway of a parent. But I think actually one of the things that was distinctive about growing up as the child of a historian, but also actually broader in a family that had such a deep sense of the past, is that the stories that you grow up with, and I don't just mean kind of family histories, but stories that people in your community are always embedded in larger stories. And so you have this kind of sense that the deeply personal questions about who you are and where you came from are part of larger historical questions. And so, I remember whenever we go into the city of Sydney, Dad, because he has this incredible knowledge, he would just tell us all about, I remember hearing about how the wool stores worked in the rocks in the convict days and what the trades hall was all about and the different parts of Sydney. But likewise, I remember hearing from the other side of the family about the convict heritage and then the ability actually to kind of build a life up on the Hawkesbury. And I remember hearing from my violin teacher, who's actually a refugee, she and her husband from Ceausescu's Romania, and the story of going through refugee camps and arriving in Australia as immigrant Australians, refugees, and then forming a new life as proud Australians. And I think the wonderful thing about this is that they're personal stories, but they're also stories that make you realise that the personal is part of a much larger, deeper history, a history of immigration, the history of refugees, working class history, the history of nations, the history of, I remember my grandmother talking about hearing Japanese shelling in Newcastle during World War II, part of these larger histories, and it does form you. And I think it did give me the ability, I think, to realise just how ahistorical our contemporary culture is.
Yeah. There's something, I guess a great debate in history over whether there's an inevitability of history versus it's people who shape history. I mean, where do you fall on that? You talk about this being part of a greater story. You have a strong Christian perspective in your research, which has come later in life. It wasn't something you grew up with. Is it the sense that there's a predetermination of our story and our history, or do you think people like Robert Menzies and Winston Churchill and Napoleon and, the list can go on, are these the people who have shaped history and key decisions actually changed the course of history?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that people, I think, obviously to paraphrase a certain famous historian here, I think it was Marx actually, people make history, but they don't make it in circumstances of their own choosing. I think there are particular historical moments actually when, the decisions of individuals are profoundly important, the figures that you just mentioned. But there are also larger historical forces at work, ways of thinking. As a historian of ideas, I'm particularly interested in, what are the broad ways that we think about ideas about the history of justice or the history of what is a human being or what are rights. So I think there are larger forces at work, but I think it is also the case that there are particular individuals. I mean, Martin Luther, for example, I think the Protestant Reformation probably would have occurred in some sense through attempts to reform the church, but without Luther, it would have been very, very different. So I think, the best kind of answer is to think about both of those things, holding them in tension somewhat.
Yeah. Australia has been racked over the decades by the history wars. John Howard famously said you shouldn't have a black armband view of history, and that term isn't so commonly used these days, but I think we'd still understand that it's this sense that our history is something to be ashamed of, that Australia is an illegitimate country, that British invaded the country and stole the land from the Indigenous people. And so all that flowed from there was really is from a foundation of illegitimacy, and we should be deeply, deeply shameful and eternally repenting of the sins of our forebears. This sort of sense that historians actually have a duty as the storytellers of our nation, but, uncovering new stories, but also interpreting the past so that the present people, if they are choosing to pay any attention to it, which of course at the moment we don't think they really are, that they can understand it in terms that make sense to them. I mean, how do you see the role of a historian these days, Sarah?
Yeah. Well, I have used, so in the book, it's called Priests of History, and the subtitle, Stewarding the Past in an Ahistoric Age. And it's because I see the role of a historian. And when I say historian, I don't actually just mean academic historians. I mean, I think we all actually have this duty, this, as it were, kind of calling to live into larger stories, but also to steward them, to uncover them, to keep them and to pass them down. And in the book, I kind of talk about two aspects of this work of stewarding the past. The word priest, by the way, is just a reference to the fact that priestly work in the Old Testament is a work of both tending and keeping, and those two things being slightly different but entirely compatible. So to tend is to sort of to cultivate, and yet to keep is kind of to preserve and pass down. And I think this is actually a really compelling and beautiful way of thinking about the responsibility that we all have to steward the past. Because on the one hand, I think we want to cultivate, there are overlooked stories in the past. There are things that we don't know about that need to be uncovered, cultivated, and passed down. And yet at the same time, there's also a kind of more strictly conservative sense of just preserving what has been passed down to us. So preserving that inheritance as well. I think if I could give an example of the sort of tending aspect of this, that's actually really kind of pertinent, ties in nicely actually with the Australian question as well. In the book, I tell the story of William Cooper, who's a name that might be familiar to a lot of people. Although, interestingly enough, my students haven't really gone through high school and arriving at uni ever really having heard of William Cooper before. But Cooper, one of the earliest really Indigenous activists for his people, very famously in the 1930s, collects signatures on a petition that he wants. He sends it to Joseph Lyons, the Prime Minister. He hopes it never gets sent to the King. But signatures advocating for the extension of full civic and political rights to Aboriginal Australians. And the really interesting thing about this is that this is a story that's sort of known, but it's not something clearly that's taught in high schools. But one of the things that I think is clearly not known about it and needs to be uncovered is the fact that, it's really interesting that Cooper's entire desire is actually for Indigenous Australians to have the full benefits, actually, of British and then Australian, laws and institutions, to become, as he puts it, full citizens in Australian society. And he makes his argument, actually, in the petition, based upon, perhaps surprisingly to us today, but he quotes the Book of Acts in the New Testament, because his basis for saying, no, Aboriginal lives, they matter, is because all lives matter. And he quotes the Book of Acts, and he says, it's because we are of one blood with the white Australians. It's the Book of Acts referring to the fact that God created all of humanity. And so that Christian aspect, like in the National Museum of Australia, for example, has a little part of their exhibition on Cooper. There are web pages about him. Very few of them. And the National Museum of Australia's webpage about Cooper doesn't even mention his Christian inheritance there. And I think just as interesting, and the fact that the entire kind of argument is based on these Christian principles, but more interesting too, and this is the kind of thing that actually really surprised my students, is that they, I think, go through high school with this kind of sense that it's a very kind of totalising ideological approach to the past, where they're basically taught, look, all Indigenous people, they feel that they're oppressed and they always wanted unceded sovereignty, to just reject everything about the British project. And so they had these categories where they're like, Indigenous people would have thought missionaries terrible, Australian state and sovereignty terrible. And then we read about William Cooper, and plenty of letters that he wrote that you read, and you read the sources, and they are absolutely taken aback. And I actually have had them say to me, oh my goodness, I had no idea that actually the history of Indigenous activism in Australia was not a sort of totalising rejection of the entire British project and of the Australian nation from the get-go. I had no idea that they actually wanted to be part of Australia. And it's like, yeah, this is fascinating, right? And, even the fact that here's Cooper making a petition, what he's drawing upon there is actually a very ancient right, dates back to the Magna Carta, actually, in the Anglophone Western tradition, the right of a citizen to petition the government or the king for the redress of grievances is literally what is enabling Cooper to write his petition. It's what he's drawing upon. So he's wanting to be incorporated into the Western tradition. He wants this for his people. And he's drawing upon an ancient political Magna Carta, sort of medieval political freedom here. And yet, for what we do know about Cooper, we largely don't even understand that he's part of this larger story. And in fact, that far from wanting to kind of reject everything about British or Australian sovereignty, what he wants is to be part of the Australian nation.
That actually his activism is using the tools of the British system and the British inheritance in order to appeal to his rights. And so, it's really interesting, Sarah, and perhaps explains, from my perspective, a bit of the reluctance of young people to want to engage in history is that it seems a bit too political, that history is not just, the facts and figures as they happened, which is actually pretty dry anyway, and most people go, oh, boring, not relevant. But this idea that history is weaponized to suit a political agenda, an ideological agenda. So, for example, the history of activism in Australia is told as, society oppressed, government system imposed from Northern Europe, thousands of kilometres away, is imposed on our country, and we are fighting against what has been imposed upon us, and eventually through great acts of activism we are able to push off the oppressor and be free. For some people, they think, it's too much of a fight. I don't like it, and I just prefer to watch reality TV.
Yeah, well, I think one of the really, really fruitful things that can be gained out of studying history is that when you actually understand those stories, so Cooper's story, for example, it enables you to overcome that and work against that tendency to weaponize history, because what you actually realize is that history can only be weaponized, right, if it can be reduced quite easily to ideological categories. But then you read about someone, you discover the history of Cooper, and you go, oh, actually, he can't be reduced to any particular ideological category, and so he can't actually be weaponized, right? Because here's a man who, for example, after the day of mourning on the sesquicentenary in 1938, worked with the Anglican Archbishop of Sydney to establish Aborigines Sunday, but that doesn't fit neatly into an ideological category either, because what Aborigines Sunday was all about was prayer for the plight of Indigenous people and advocating for proper laws by the Commonwealth government to enable Indigenous people to flourish. And actually, it sounds very odd, perhaps to contemporary ears, but again, disrupts our categories. What he wanted was, a quote, the gospel to go out to Indigenous people. So you read about this activist, and he's not sort of one of a kind. There are others. Doug Nicholls, for example, major activist in the lead up to the 1967 referendum, later governor of South Australia, and again, doesn't fit into these categories that enable him to be weaponized. Here's a man who becomes a convert to Christianity, who then plants churches, is known as Pastor Doug. So this idea that, there's always a resentment of the missionaries, for example, because they're associated with the tools of empire. It's like, oh, no, not at all. These men converted to Christianity. William Cooper's son, Daniel, who actually fought in World War I, is called Daniel because Daniel Matthews was the man who taught William Cooper to read and write on the mission station, the Maloga Mission, on the banks of the Murray in Victoria. And here he is, but he's naming his son after the missionary that taught him to write. Like, how can we weaponize history when the actual story is starting to dismantle those categories?
What about difficult periods of our history and the way, I think of, say, White Australia, which in 1901, when Federation occurs, the first act of our new Commonwealth Parliament was to pass the Immigration Restriction Act and implement in legal form White Australia. When students are taught about white Australia, they're obviously taught about it in a condemnatory way. So this was a racist policy. It was exclusionary. It was elevating the white British race over other races. And well, of course, in 2026, that is absolutely the accepted wisdom. We would never impose a race-based immigration policy, although there are some who might advocate for that, but they would be in a vast minority. But teaching history with the values overlaid of the present and condemning our forebears for the views they held also can be confusing too, because you're also in one sense favouring the social mores and values of your time in history, which, you can't be so sure that in 50, 100 years' time, people will be looking back on us as rolled gold and virtuous. But you also, I think, miss an understanding of how people thought back then if you just conceive of them and their views as completely antediluvian and potentially evil and morally bankrupt. And I mean, for example, on white Australia, it was bipartisan. It was just not controversial. It was what people thought at the time. I mean, why did they think that? If it was the majority view and not controversial, then there must have been a reason why it was not controversial. Do we want to understand those views? Do we want to understand what was the, global forces that made people think that way, the local forces that made people think that way? But I think this is another issue when it comes to getting people interested in history, that it's just teaching people about the bad of the past and the bad views of the past, and people really like a bit more of a good news story, perhaps in a world that seems so very troubled.
Yeah, for example, the white Australia policy. I think, look, there are clearly two things. I mean, even broadly speaking, when we think about injustice in the past, there are two things that it's often helpful when we study the past to kind of separate: understanding what happened in its context and also the kind of judgment that we might make. And so those two things don't have to be at odds for any reason. A really good illustration of this and the way that it can work out is the issue with slavery historically. So I've had students in the past who basically think that the history of the British Empire, that's just the history of slavery. And so it's like, hold on a minute. Let's just backtrack. The British Empire is the first empire in history to abolish slavery. And so when you actually understand the history, it's the case that, hold on, slavery has existed as an institution really in every civilization and society throughout history. And there was an attempt actually, and then a successful attempt in 1807 when the slave trade was abolished, and in 1833 when the institution of slavery was abolished. Actually, the British abolished it. So when you said a moment ago, one of the reasons perhaps why history is unattractive is that it just seems as if it can just be a kind of terrible story of shame. I think it's important that you can look to particular moments in history and stories from the past that give hope as well. And there are plenty of those, like look at the abolition of the slave trade. But also actually, and the other thing that you said there too is sort of a reference to our sort of tendency to think that we're on a moral high ground when we approach the past too. I mean, one of the things when I teach history of slave trade and its abolition that I always point out to students is, actually, including our own society, like slavery as an institution exists in the contemporary world, in contemporary Australia, and it's because of the global porn industry and sex industry where women and children are living in conditions of slavery. So the notion that somehow we don't have slavery anymore is just kind of rubbish. So that's the other kind of wonderful thing about studying history. It does give you a kind of ability to show some humility about your own moral shortcomings as well.
You came to Christianity as an adult, as far as I can gather from reading about you, Sarah. It wasn't part of your upbringing. And there's been, including in your writings, there's been a sense that, the decline in historical knowledge and the appreciation of history is linked to a decline in religious observance in the West. And it's amazing to look at the figures in the Australian census of people identifying as Christian going down over the years. I mean, in Menzies' time, it was sky high. People certainly, as a sort of tradition and cultural thing, would go to church. It was a very, very common thing to do. It was a way of not just your religious belief, but coming together of the community on a Sunday, but gave people a sense of, shared morality, shared values, a touch point each week of a sort of moral Christian story. How for you has that decline in religious observance in Australia and across the West? And I know you've lived in the United States and the UK, so you've got a good Anglosphere set of experiences. How is that linked to the decline in the importance of history?
Yeah, I actually think it's really complicated. I don't think for one moment I could say that it's caused by or really related necessarily in any causal way with the decline in religious observance or church attendance. And I actually think that even Christianity in the West itself is becoming increasingly, some parts of that Christian culture is becoming quite ahistorical. I think perhaps what I could say broadly is that I think there is a sense in which we often don't, and I just mean this broadly culturally, but I think it's also true of Christians, we actually don't realise the Christian underpinnings of so many of the values and the ideas that we just kind of take for granted. I mean, even the idea, for example, that those who wield power ought to do so not for their own glory, but rather not only for the people, but to serve others and in fact to care for the vulnerable, like the idea that the weak and the vulnerable might have claims on those in power. And we take that for granted today. It's something that those on the right and indeed those on the left have imbibed as central to various political platforms. And I think generally we tend to think this is just a kind of secular like principle that somehow we've imbibed from the Enlightenment. It's like, oh, no, actually this, and there are other examples too, could talk about human rights. But I mean, this particular idea of what it means to hold power and how to lead, to serve others and to care for the vulnerable, that is a legacy of Christianity. I mean, you can understand how radical that is when you look at the ancient classical world where basically power is about lording it over those who are weak. I mean, look at the way that Roman emperors behaved, for example. And one of the things that Christianity does when it breaks into the world is that it upends those power relationships and it actually says, oh no, and it's because this kind of really radical idea, and it's an idea in the Torah, it's in the Jewish tradition too, but really kind of made relevant to the rest of the world, I think, by Christianity, which says, oh no, this is like all people are invited into this people who know God. And the idea is, oh no, all human beings are of equal moral worth and infinitely precious. And there's no disparity in terms of their moral worth between those who are weak and strong, black or white, male or female. Like, actually, I'm paraphrasing Paul's letter to the Galatians there in the New Testament. Like, we think these ideas are secular and they come out of the Enlightenment often. And it's like, oh no, that's Christianity. Now, over the centuries, they've been secularized in various ways. They've had their theological content gradually denuded from them, but they're grounded in Christian ideas. And I think the beginning of that kind of long heritage of those ideas, which have borne such fruit, I mean, never pursued perfectly, but have borne such fruit throughout history, is something we tend to forget. And it's probably true of culture in and outside of the church.
Australia is, we call it a multicultural society. Some people don't like that. They want to say we're multi-ethnic. But the reality is there's obviously a large proportion of the population who are of no faith, and then people of the Christian faith, Muslim, Hindu, and a whole range of others. The ideas of democracy and human rights that have Christian foundations, but as you say, are now secularized, I guess to express a sort of sense that they're universal concepts, even though the reality is they're not universal concepts. You can go to other parts of the world where this human rights discourse is completely at odds with their culture and the development of their legal system. But, I mean, is it important to remind people of the historical roots of human rights and democracy, our liberal democracy, that they are Christian roots? Or are we in danger of alienating those concepts from a country like Australia, a population that doesn't necessarily all share the sort of Christian point of view? So 100 years ago it would have been uncontroversial, but in 2026, how do you tell the story with those Christian foundations in a way that is accepted to the broader population?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Even just sort of to preface my answer with something, just a quick reference to democracy. So the kind of liberal democracy that we have in the West is both, like, I would never be so simplistic. One ought not to be as to simply say, oh, it just stems from Christianity. The democratic tradition, of course, is Greek, but in its particular way that it comes into the West, And the idea that, well, democracy is then tempered by the idea that it's not just a democracy for the wealthy male citizens, which it was in 5th century Athens. That takes many hundreds of years to be played out, but that's the Christian. So there it's a coming together then of a classical tradition from Greece and also a Christian tradition that says, well, therefore the fruits of these political rights ought to be applied to all people. And that's the Christian insight there. So coming together of both traditions. But yeah, so your question is really about how wise is it to be explicit about the historical foundations of so many of these ideas in Christianity when we live in a multi-faith society? I mean, first of all, I think truth is good in and of itself. And so given that there are historical foundations of these ideas and they rest upon these underpinnings, like you're not going to have, I mean, there are real issues, even lives at stake, if you cease to believe that every human life is of equal moral worth. You simply do have to, I think, tell the truth. I mean, carefully and with due attention to the complexity of traditions. Like, it's not just nearly as simple as saying, like, all these things came purely from Christianity. But the underpinning of certain ideas, yes, I think it does need to be told. I mean, probably a particular example that I think is helpful is the sort of freedom of religion, because that speaks directly into your sense that, well, hold on, we do live in a multi-faith society. But the freedom of religion idea is a really pertinent one there, right? Because here are people of different faith and indeed of no faith who enjoy that freedom today because of Section 116 of the Constitution that limits the Commonwealth's power to establish religion. But that in itself is a useful thing to kind of unpack, because historically, the separation of church and state and of religion and politics is a distinctly Western phenomenon. If it's been imported in other countries, it's because it's imported as a kind of legacy of like Western expansion. But it's a Western phenomenon. And the reason it emerges is that you've got this history of thinking about, right back to the ancient world, about the relationship between like for St. Augustine of Hippo, the relationship of the church and the world are not one and the same things. It even goes back, I mean, even Augustine's grounding on the fact that Jesus, holds up this coin and says, well, whose face is, on this coin? It's Caesar's face, so you render to Caesar. In other words, the political government, the authority, those things which belong to Caesar's. But your spiritual, the things that mean that you are members of a different kind of society, a church, right? These things are not the same as you being part of a political organisation. The theological grounding for that then gets, over many centuries, kind of worked out. A lot of it has to do with what happened after the Reformation and in the 18th and 19th century, when Britain had to think very carefully about the fact that there were limits on who could be full members of Britain because there was an established church. But there is a very particular history here, and we only have the separation of church and state, and therefore freedom to participate, have full political citizenship rights, and not be a member of an established church because we inherit that history. Before being at ACU, I was at Western Sydney University, taught at the Bankstown campus, where probably the majority of my students were Muslims. And one of the really interesting things about teaching that history to Muslim students is that some of them, I think, the more sort of liberal ones, would actually appreciate the fact, like they would understand, often because there's a sort of history of living under oppression and fleeing an Islamic country where there is no freedom of religion. They would understand that, oh yeah, actually in Australia, I can be a Muslim and I have freedom to worship. And they're really interested in this history because they're like, why is that? That's not how it was for my family in Iran, for example. And so they kind of appreciate that. So I think there are ways actually that the Christian kind of the virtues of this story can actually be really helpful, and they can be a source for unity. And I think in our contemporary moment in Australia where we seem to be, I think tragically, so polarised and fragmented, and we seem to be increasingly violent about what it means to live here and what it means to be a citizen, I think we can actually turn to history and find in it some source of cohesion and hope.
Yeah, well, a wonderful note to end on, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light. It's been a fascinating discussion.
Oh, it was a pleasure, Georgina.
History matters because ideas matter. Thank you for listening to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. To follow more of our work, subscribe to the podcast and visit robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. I'm Georgina Downer. Until next time.